The Project Cars franchise is a series that I have a very deep connection to. I got into the first game in the series about halfway through its life cycle, and I became an immediate supporter of the franchise. While the game had its flaws, the underpinnings were something that were incredibly strong, and when I heard that Project Cars 2 was in development, I couldn't have been more excited. Project Cars 2 released around the same time as Forza Motorsport 7, which was one of my least favorite games in the Motorsport franchise. Project Cars 2, on the other hand, immediately became one of my all-time favorite racing games. It struck the perfect balance of accessibility from newcomers to sim racing genres, while also satisfying some of the more involved sim racing community. The game faced massive success compared to the first one, both commercially and along the racing game community in general. Project Cars 2 still has a very active player base today, and when someone asks me, do I play Project Cars 2, Project Cars 3, Project Cars 1, I always recommend to start with 2. When Project Cars 3 was first announced, and I saw the announcement trailer, I immediately knew something was off. The physics in the game looked very arcadey, less sim-like than before. The trailer also showed off more drifting and supercars crashing into each other than close, fair racing. As we got closer to release, concerns immediately ramped up with the news that pit stops, fuel, tire wear would all be removed from the game. Number one rule of game design: do not mess with your core fan base, especially for a series like Project Cars. The cars in the series standing for Community Assisted Racing Simulator. And as soon as Project Cars 3 released, everyone knew this was not a Project Cars game. As I will be mentioning deeper in this video, it is not all a bad game, but it is a horrible Project Cars game. Now, a quick disclaimer while I get into the video. This video is fueled by my passion for the first two games in the series. I've logged close to 1,000 hours if you combine both games, and I truly do care about this series as well as sim racing as a whole. It's a genre that I am very passionate about and have played for most of my life. And a lot of the points and things that I bring up in this video are going to be biased towards that side of someone who grew up with sim racing and truly cares about it. But without further ado, let's discuss Project Cars 3 and what it got right and what it got very, very wrong. Now, it would be a little disingenuous of me to immediately come out and just start mentioning all of the things that Project Cars 3 gets wrong without actually looking at some of the things that it improved on from previous games. So let's start off here by looking at some of the things that Project Cars 3 actually did really quite well. First off, let's talk about the career mode. Career mode in Project Cars 1 and 2 were very basic, especially in Project Cars 1. It was not as thought out as some of the competitors in the simcade genre. I know most simulation games don't necessarily have a career mode, but when it came to Project Cars 2, I felt the career mode was good, but there was no real drive to complete the campaign mode, since you could basically drive whatever car you wanted by just going to a custom event. Project Cars 3 fixes this issue by having a kind of similar story mode progression to PC2, but making it meaningful because you actually have to spend money to buy cars in-game. This means that progressing throughout this career mode will actually allow you to purchase these cars, and you don't just get them from the start of the game like previous games. The career mode is divided into certain chapters for specific vehicle classes, starting off with your slower grade road cars and working all the way up to the upper echelons of motorsport. Each vehicle class has 4 different mini championships inside of it, and these championships are pretty basic, but you can have multiple event types in them. So you'll of course have your standard races, your circuit races, and then you will have interesting new little events like time trials, which again, I like the mixing up of events here. We didn't really have a lot of that in PC2, it was mostly just races, but the addition of time trials is something that I actually really quite like. I found this career mode to be so much better and more organized than PC2's, and leagues better than Project Cars 1. This career really does reward progression. although I do have one issue with it. The fact that you can purchase your way into championships is quite silly to me, especially because of how little it costs to actually purchase the next championship. I don't see the reason for this. Just play the game. It's really not that difficult. Now, I mentioned earlier that Project Cars 3 has you buy cars, and this is because of the in-game currency. And thank God it is not plagued by microtransactions. This currency can be used to purchase cars, upgrade them, and customize them, which is my next thing that I have that is a huge pro for Project Cars 3. The fact that you can purchase the cars in 3 is a definite improvement over the second one, and it's definitely a lot more rewarding than the previous games when you could, again, literally just go to custom event and drive whatever car you wanted. Now, this is definitely something that leans into what I'm going to mention later in the video, and it's the fact that this game is no longer a simulation title. Now, let's get into some of the upgrades and customization features that I think are a massively great addition to Project Cars 3. Starting with the performance upgrades, I love this addition, allowing you to upgrade your tires and brakes, add forced induction, add a custom cold air intake, all the way up until converting your road car into a full race conversion. It really reminds me a lot of the older, I believe it was the Need for Speed Shift games had something similar. I really liked that back in those games, and I think it's a great thing to have here. Another thing that I really do quite like is that you have to actually upgrade your suspension in order to unlock alignment tuning. Just like in real life, you can't take your bone standard Mustang and just go crazy with camber and tow. You can't do that. You're gonna need to get camber plates and aftermarket coilover suspension in order to do that. Speaking of tuning, the one thing that I was slightly disappointed by in PC3 is that they've really dumbed down the tuning menu into much less categories, and it really simplifies it. Just take a look at the difference between Project Cars 2's tuning menu and then Project Cars 3. It's a pretty substantial difference, and for someone like me who loves to spend the time absolutely perfecting the tune of your vehicle to the perfect specifications and makes it drive exactly how I want to, you can still do that in 3, but it's really not quite as good as PC2. But hey, at least we actually have tuning still in the game. Now, customization is next up, and this is something that is massively improved over Project Cars 2. You can of course change your paint color by selecting from OEM colors or a custom color, as same as adding on liveries that are pre-programmed and customized from the developers. But now you can actually change your wheels from custom aftermarket wheels from big name brand manufacturers like BBS, HRE, 1552, all the way to more specific brands for certain types of vehicles like Krager and RS Watanabe. And it's not just wheels, it's tires too. You can choose from some of the biggest brands in tires: Michelin, Bridgestone, Pirelli, all the way down to my personal favorite tire brand, Nitto, which I run on my own vehicles in real life, and I love to see them in games. For customization, you have multiple save slots for the same vehicle, so you can choose to have maybe a more street designed approach, and then you can go all the way down to a crazy modified one too. Now next up, something that Project Cars 3 inherited from the past 2 games in the series is some of the absolute best track lists in all of racing games. There are over 50 different tracks, and that's not including all of the variations in the individual tracks themselves. One thing that is kind of unfortunate to me is that there is the removal of Spa, which is my all-time favorite racetrack. It's unfortunately due to licensing. They lost the license for Spa, but it really sucks since I would love to race that track in this game. But talking about some of the new tracks that Project Cars 3 added to the game, some of them are really quite good and some of them are just not for me. Tuscany is my favorite. I really love this one. It's got some massive elevation changes and really quite unsettling off-camber corners. It's a ton of fun and can be a challenge in the different cars. Monument Canyon is next up, and I actually found this one to be pretty good. I don't quite enjoy it as much as Tuscany, but a lot of the background scenery is what makes up for some of the stranger corners on this track, but again, I kinda like it. Now, Havana is the next one up, and this one is a really mixed bag. Some variants of the track are pretty good, but some just feel really quite off to me. Now, the final thing that I want to mention that Project Cars 3 really gets right is also one thing that really leads into its downfall, and it's the fact that it is the most accessible game in the series. You know, it really improved tremendously on controller gameplay and having a much more similar gameplay and progression structure to games like Forza and Gran Turismo. But this also means that it makes me like the game a little less, because it feels more like a Forza Lite than an actual sim racer. Next up, I'm going to get into my explanation of why I feel this game just doesn't live up to the Project Cars nameplate. Now, directly going off of my final pro for this game, I need to discuss how simplifying the gameplay experience was just the wrong decision to make. Now, as I said earlier in the video, Project Cars 2 hit the nail right on the head. While not quite a full-on simulation title as R-Factor 2 or iRacing, or heck, even Assetto Corsa, it was still accessible enough for racers looking for that next step up after, say, Forza Motorsport. Project Cars 2 made you put effort in learning how to control a car and tune a car. You had to learn the physics a bit and tune the vehicle to suit your desired driving style. But this didn't take very long, and once you got it, you were much better equipped to get into some of the more hardcore simulation games down the line. Project Cars 3, on the other hand, tried to capture the Forza and Gran Turismo crowd, who are not going to switch to a game with a smaller car list, less customization, much less polished experience. This was just a goal that was never going to work. Project Cars 3 is missing that one feature that sells a game. It tries to copy the other games without doing anything that actually sets itself different from them. And this is where, again, Project Cars 2 just hit the perfect spot. And it was one of only maybe 2 games on console that were in that niche of not quite more of an arcade style, but a little more to the sim style. Project Cars 2 and Assetto Corsa were basically your only choices on console if you wanted to get more in depth into the sim racing community. Meanwhile, Project Cars 3 just can't compete with anything. And it's not just me spouting this, for example. Look at sales figures. Project Cars 3 hasn't sold anywhere near as well as Project Cars 2. And look at the active player base. Look at the difference in people playing Project Cars 2 versus 3. It's incredibly obvious that this goal didn't work and it was never going to. So that leads me with this one question. Who was this game for? Now, as I mentioned, Project Cars 3 did some slight improvements over the previous games, and I will admit it did, but I need to get into some of the things that it just took a humongous step backwards on. These steps backwards were really not taken well by the community, and let's discuss what these features were and why they're just so puzzling. Let's start off with the removal of previous features. Pit stops, fuel usage, tire wear, and qualifying have all been removed. Why, you may ask? Well, it was done to focus on quote-unquote the racing experience. How on earth is removing features that make racing focusing on the racing experience? What does that even mean? You're removing things that make realism in motorsport. Do you watch F1? They have pit stops, they have tire wear, they don't do fuel anymore, but you understand my point. Real motorsport has these features, and if you're going to call yourself a sim racing title or even a simcade title, you have to have these features in the game. All of this adds up and is just a pathetic excuse, and it's actually just a removal of content in the game, resulting in a less complete driving experience than before. Not a better one. Now you might be thinking, well, at least they probably improved the physics, right? No, these physics are much worse than 2. What they've done is they've made road cars feel like your front shock absorbers are filled with gelatin. There is no precision in steering feel or off-center responsiveness. There's none of that here. Another thing that they've done is they've made race cars too easy to drive. If you've ever been around a real race car in real life, you know that they're not easy to drive. You can't just get in them and start setting lap times. You have to get brakes up to temperature. And on top of that, the suspension is hard as a rock. So you're not going to be able to just go bouncing off of curbs like you can in this game, which is ironic because race cars are basically the only truly enjoyable cars to drive in this game. At least for me. You know, if you enjoy it, that's totally fine, you respect that, but I just cannot get around how they said they're going to focus on the driving and racing experience. And then they made it worse. All of these things add into a game that is no longer a simulation title. This is an arcade racer. I cannot even call this a simcade racer. There's nothing simulation about it. Just because there's cars on a racetrack instead of an open world doesn't make it a sim. But it's more than just driving and the gameplay experience that has ruined this game for me. Just look at some of the horrific performance issues and graphic embarrassment. Starting off with performance issues. I cannot get a stable frame rate on this game no matter what I do. I've played this game on both Xbox One and PC, and neither of them can I get a single game where it's a stable, smooth frame rate. And you would think after a year of the game being out, this must have at least been somewhat fixed, but no, it's still just unstable. Now I must admit here, the first two games were no saints here. They both released with unstable frame rates as well. But you would think after all of these years, they might have found a solution to how to make their games actually play better, right? Now after some of the performance issues, we need to talk visuals. Starting off with the UI and just the art style in general. This looks like a mobile game. Not just in terms of graphical quality, but in the way everything's designed. Look at the menus. Everything is big, it's bold, it's vibrant, it's colorful. It reminds me of something that you can easily just tap on your screen and go play Garage, auto show. And in the menus, I must say, what happened to these car models? Why do they look like this? They look like plastic cars. There's no reflections in the paint, and the wheels just look, again, plastic. This is pretty much unacceptable for a 2020 title, and throughout my time playing, I've never had a moment when I went, wow, this game looks really quite good. In fact, I've had moments when I've gone, wow, this game is horrible looking. And to show you what I mean, just take a look at some of these screenshots. I don't know how this is acceptable in a game that is this new, and you would think because of all these graphical flaws that, oh yeah, that game should be able to keep at 30 FPS, right? Nah. Unfortunately, the graphics alone and the performance issues, that's not just it. This game is full of bugs, still even a year after launch. Like for example, this really weird one that I keep getting when it comes to the showroom, giving me fake discounted cars but having them 0% off. I keep getting this one and I just don't know why. But that's not it too. Audio issues with car audio cutting out, textures not loading. It's a real shame. And again, the first two games in the series had these issues too, but at least from what I've noticed, not as prevalent as here. And if you combine all of these things together, it just feels so much less polished, complete, and misguided compared to the first two games. But without further ado, let's get into my final thoughts and what I think about the future of this series. Now, as I said closer to the start of the video, this game really is not all bad. It's just really not a good Project Cars game. It's a case of trying to diversify your audience gone wrong. Sim racing just isn't for everyone, and to try and make it so while betraying the community that actually made this game and this series so special was one of the worst decisions that they could have made. This game really hurt, and I have a really bad feeling that there won't be another Project Cars game after how poorly this game performed. But can it be saved? Theoretically, yes, but with all this bad PR and the reputation that's completely gone from this series, it's going to be a damn near impossible challenge. What Slightly Mad Studios needs to do in what I have this vision is go back to the formula that they had with the first two games, but slightly expand on them and make them as polished as you possibly can, and do what they do best, which is just bridging that gap between a full-on sim and then some of the simcade games that it competes with. That's what the first two games did so well, was being that next step up in order for those people who really found an interest and passion for racing and sim racing, who just didn't quite feel ready to jump into iRacing and some of these more intense sims. Project Cars 2 was there for them. You could really learn from that game, learn how tuning works in depth. They had a much better ranked option in the multiplayers and was great for online racing. So if they were to stick to that first two and then just expand on them a little more, make them as polished as possible, no bugs, no weird texture issues, I think that could maybe possibly work for them. But I don't think they'll have funding for it. I think this Project Cars 3 just destroyed the franchise here. And man, would I hope to be wrong. Playing this game was really disappointing. I put off playing this game for so many months after its initial release because I knew that I was going to be disappointed. But I had never expected it to be this disappointing. This one really hit hard. And it's a really big lesson on not to change from what you're good at. Don't try and copy every single other game studio. Try and do what you do best. Now, that's going to end the video here. In terms of, do I recommend Project Cars 3? If you haven't played the first two games in this series, I still recommend start with 2. It's a much more complete experience than this one. But if you're the type of person who really enjoys more arcade games, you're not super into sim racing, you like Forza, I still say Project Cars 2. But if you're just not comfortable with that, maybe try this one out. It's often really heavily discounted since no one will actually pay full price for the game. Thank God I did not spend my money on a full price version of this game, and I am still disappointed with the $20 that I spent. But yeah, that's going to be the end for this video. And I really hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know if you want to see more sim racing content. I'm planning on doing some more in the future and would really like to hear your thoughts on that. So without further ado, thank you so much for watching the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.